At this stage, it just isn't fair. I mean, how can a Star Wars fan, let alone an avid hobbyist, possibly keep up with all these awesome Jedi sculpts of characters that we now all love thanks to the Clone Wars animated show? All I can say with confidence is it's a good time to be a Star Wars fan, even if my wallet doesn't necessarily agree. Hi guys, welcome back to Planet Mithril, and today I'm showing you my take on how to paint Jedi Master Plo Koon from the Star Wars Shatterpoint range of models. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone here in the fond memories of seeing this random alien Jedi Master cropping up in the loading screen for the PlayStation 1 game Star Wars Jedi Power Battles. Of all things, wielding a yellow lightsaber, which was the key thing that you took away from that there. Having only ever seen him very briefly in The Phantom Menace looking ever so resplendent in the Jedi Council chambers. Having only seen a few snippets of him throughout the following two films, it wasn't until Star Wars The Clone Wars where Plo Koon actually started to become a fully fledged character, full of heart and wisdom, and always willing to do what he could for the well-being of his friends and troops. Plo Koon has become yet another fan favourite Jedi in the hearts of a lot of Star Wars fans, even if he now doesn't have his yellow lightsaber. Now, Plo Koon is an interesting model. He has a very unique shape and skin colour due to him being a Kel Dor, so I'm going to be using some pastel-y, bright oranges and yellows to try and capture this, combined with some sharp, dark greys around the mouthpiece, which will act as a nice contrast. Combining this with the richer, more chocolatey mahogany hues I'm going to be using for the majority of his robes and leathers, all set off beautifully with the bright blue spot colour for his saber blade. I'm working off a grey undercoat for my Star Wars model here, which was applied using Citadel Spray Mechanica Standard Grey. Well, that's enough jabbering from me, guys. Brush is ready, and let's get painting. It's important for the overall look of Plo that the base tone for his Kel Dor Skin is nailed right from the off. To begin with, I'm going to apply a base coat to Plo's head and fingers, well, claws, using orange leather, applying this in a few thinner layers to get a nice smooth finish, making sure I work this in all the recesses over his uniquely shaped head. I'm leaving the mouthpiece here as this will be a different colour later on. The majority of his Jedi robes I'm now giving a solid base coat using red leather. This will translate to a rich mahogany brown tone later on in the process, but I want to get a slight rich red base tone running throughout his robes to help him stand out against other Jedi. I'm now carefully picking out the inner robes, namely his neckline and the trousers, using Gobi brown, an eye-catching juxtaposition against the more rich chocolatey brown. The boots and belt I'm now picking out using Indian Shadow. This will just help soften the contrast between the rich and more natural browns. With the boots, make sure you work this into all the edges and sides of all the ridge patterning. I'm not base coating the arm guards at this point either, as I want to get all the rich colours done first to minimise it bleeding out onto the smooth white finish, which, let's be honest, is probably quite likely for me to do. The Kel Dor, particularly Plo Koon, have such a unique and recognisable tone to that alien skin. Now I'm going to try and build this up as naturally as possible, whilst trying to define all the detail over the scalp and inside the tentacles in particular. I'm applying an initial all-over shade using diluted Indian Shadow, making sure to manoeuvre this into all the recesses over his head and hands. Now I'm going to start building up the more vibrant upper tones of the Kel Dor characteristic orange skin. To do this, I'm applying a post-shade layer using orange leather, letting the shade sit in all the recesses to create some initial depth over the texture of Plo's skin. I'm mainly focusing on just blocking out the individual lumps and ripples of flesh, as much as that sounds absolutely vile. I'm now applying an initial highlight using Kokum Copper. This is quite a jump from the orange leather to what is effectively quite a bright yellow in comparison. You can build this up with an interim 1-to-1 mix of the previous 2 paints used beforehand, but now focusing on further defining the texture and structure of Plo's head details and claws. The jump to pure Kokum Copper isn't as stark as you might think in this humble painter's opinion. I'm now applying a final highlight to all the skin now by adding Mojave White into the Kokum Copper. You can add as much or as little as you like depending on how light you want these extreme edge highlights to be. I am opting for a rough 2-to-1 ratio mix in favour of the Kokum Copper, as I don't want to risk desaturating the orange tone too much. As you can see here, this is just being applied to the uppermost prominent edges and crests of his head texture, and just defining the knuckles before I tackle the faceplate and claws. Okay, so Plo's skin is now more or less done. It's time to finish off all his facial details by picking out that infamous Kel Dor faceplate. The plating around the mouth, the tubing, spikes, eye goggles and his claws I'm now very carefully picking out using Eclipse Grey, being as targeted and controlled as possible here to avoid bleeding onto the finished orange. I'm giving these areas a quick targeted shade now using diluted black, letting this sink again in all the recesses, trying to stay as targeted and controlled here as possible for this application. Now for the highlights over these grey areas, I want to keep a really harsh edge to all the plating and framework, which will contrast really well with the more subtle blended look I've got for the rest of Plo's head. I'm very carefully just picking out the edges of the mouthpiece, goggles, and framing the outer curve of all the claws just to give them some sharpness using graphite. I'm now just applying a quick dot highlight to the sharpest, most prominent tips and corners of the faceplate and claws just to give a pinpoint light reflection off their surfaces, using Miskatonic Grey. Now I'm going to tackle the robes. Now creating different looks of all these Jedi and making them look unique on the tabletop with their robes and all their different colour palettes can be quite daunting. Thankfully Plo has a richer, redder hue to the bulk of his robes, which we're going to have to try and balance against the more muted natural tones of the skin and trousers and other areas on the model. To do this, I'll be using some starker, more desaturated tones to bring up the final look of the tunic. However, to begin with, I'm applying a manual shade to all the very well defined recessed folds using Tinderlost Red, just to create some initial shading. I'm going to start working at the tone of the tunic folds now by applying a blocking layer to separate out the texture of the tunic material with a rough 3-to-1 mix of red leather and Sahara yellow. This will level out the hue of the red leather here and keep it slightly pastel-y, which in turn is helping me work out my paint selection for the following layers and highlights. Now the mix I'm using for Plo's robes is a slightly more complicated mix than I'd like to be using here otherwise, but I think that the gradual build-up brings out the best on this sculpt. For the following layer stages, I'm adding pink flesh into the previous mix. Now the red leather Sahara yellow mix will have a vaguely pinky tone, which I'm now simply looking to accentuate by adding in this more intense flesh tone. It's worth mentioning that you can jump straight to this highlight of pure pink flesh here if you wish, without upsetting the balance too much, mainly due to the tone of the robes after the previous blocking layer. With the final highlight stage, I'm simply looking at just framing the upper curves and folds of material and framing more of the larger areas of hanging cloth around his waist. I'm going to get the trousers and undercloth done at this stage as well, just so I can get the bulk of the material done in one fell swoop. I'm applying a manual shade to the trousers using brown grey, working this into the recesses as I did with the tunic. I'm now applying a blocking layer to separate out the texture of the trouser folds using a 1-to-1 mix of Gobi brown and Thra brown, leaving the brown grey showing in the recesses. Slowly building up the layers over the trouser creases, working up to a layer using pure Thra brown, and now concentrating this on where the main stress points are, where his legs are pressing up against the trouser material themselves. I'm now applying a final extreme edge highlight to the most pronounced creases in the trousers now using pure birch, keeping this tight and controlled as it's quite a bright jump in tone. There, that's now his robes and all his cloth done. We're officially over the halfway model to getting Plo tabletop ready. Now the boots and belt have a very similar tone to that of the robes, so it's important to try and create some subtle differentiation here to avoid the robes blending in with this too much and it just becoming one big amorphous blob of brown. I'm going to start by applying an all-over shade using diluted Arbuckle's brown, working this into the grooves of the belt and then amongst the cross-hatch detailing of the boots themselves. I'm now framing the outside structure of the boot rims, the grid patterning and fold of the feet, as well as the outer ridges of the belt with a 1-to-1 mix of Indian Shadow and Sandalwood, bringing up the tone a lot quicker than I have with the robes, which will give it a more defined leathery look. For the final edge highlight, I'm using pure sandalwood, and by keeping a super thin point to my brush, just accentuate the absolute edges of the boots and belt. The differentiation between these areas and the robes is subtle, but definitely works, so I'd say mission accomplished there. And now, once again, I get the joys of having to paint clone armour. Why the Republic couldn't have made this any other colour and spared the psyche of many an avid hobbyist having to paint so much smooth white plate armour, I don't know. I'm base coating the forearm gauntlets with a 3:1 mix of white and graphite. Now I'm having to apply this in several thin down layers to get a smooth, unblemished finish. With my base coat in place, I'm applying a quick targeted shade with some heavily diluted petroleum grey. This will just help separate the individual plates of clone armour and sink into the grooves around the elbow. With my shade now thoroughly dry, I'm going to re-block out the upper panelling of the clone armour with the previous base coat mix. Again, a few thin coats will be needed, but not nearly as many as for the base coat stage. I'm now applying an extreme edge highlight to the edges of the clone armour plating using pure white. Now I'm not diluting this as I want the white to be really sharp and well defined over the armour itself. Again, keeping a super fine point to your brush to keep this from blemishing my super clean, smooth finish to the gauntlets. And there's a small amount of glove material that sits underneath the hand panel of clone armour, which I'm carefully now just picking out using Eclipse Grey. The Republic symbol that is etched into the top of the gauntlets can now very carefully be picked out with blood red. When I say carefully, I mean carefully. This is, however, not a necessary addition if you're not up to it, as a petroleum wash will have shaded this in earlier on. I'm picking out the hilt of the lightsaber and any extra buckles and rivets around the belt in particular using thrash metal. Following up with a quick targeted shade using Nuln Oil. I'm applying a solid base coat to the lightsaber blade using Sky Blue over a few thin down coats again for a smooth, clean finish. It took everything in me not to paint this blade yellow for Plo's first ever appearance in Jedi Power Battles. If you know, you know. Building up the top half of the blade now with a gradual mix of sky blue and white. Another Jedi Master brought to life and ready to hit the tabletop in defence of the Republic. Plo Koon is one of my favourite non-main Jedi, and I'm so glad to have been able to share my take on the paint scheme for this awesome sculpt. I really hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Please remember to like, subscribe and hit that notification bell for video uploads, and until next time guys, take care and as always, happy hobbying.